Lord, protect us from the fury of the men of the north.
Starting in the 8th century, the Vikings swept over Europe, sacking cities and pillaging monasteries and churches. The three groups of Scandinavians who shared the same language, the same name, and the same religion set out on their expeditions to the 4 points of the compass. The Swedes turned towards the east, sailing up the rivers of Russia all the way to the Black Sea and even into Central Asia. The Danes swept over the west and south. They invaded England, France, and Spain, and carried out raids across the Mediterranean. The Norwegians headed north and then turned their boats towards the west, into the heart of the vast ocean, reaching barren and mostly uninhabited lands. Over time, the Viking myth took shape, and history transformed it into a legend. And this is why, 1,000 years after their rapid expansion, the reputation of the Vikings as cruel warriors and intrepid travelers remains intact. This reputation is only partially justified. Most of the Vikings' voyages were for commerce, and for the Norwegians, they were also expeditions in view of colonizing new lands. In Bergen, the Norrona, the only ferry that runs all year round between Norway and Iceland, is preparing to face the fury of the North Atlantic. What could have possessed those men to embark upon these unknown seas, to sail these same waters aboard simple sailboats without any navigation instruments?
The first man who found Iceland is said to have brought ravens with him, and when out at sea he let the ravens loose, and one of them flew in a straight line northwest, and he followed that one and found Iceland. That may be the story of Noah and the dove, borrowed from the Bible, but it may also be a fact. Most of the navigation was in coastal waters with landmarks, and there is a description of how to sail from Western Norway to Greenland. You go from Bergen a bit north to a place called Hernar. You sail straight west, you'll see that by the sun. Then you should see the Shetland on a clear day, that's your first landmark. The Faroe Islands, that's your second landmark. Then you should not see Iceland, but you should have seabirds coming out to fish on the banks south of Iceland, and then hit the southern tip of Greenland. 4 landmarks straight across the Atlantic.
However, it's not quite as simple as that. Before the fury of the elements, how many shipwrecks, how many families disappeared beneath the waves? As we set out from Bergen to try to follow the wake of Eric the Red, the most famous of the Viking navigators, it's the destiny of an entire people that we're attempting to understand. From its spectacular entrance into the history of Norway in the 9th century, right up until its mysterious disappearance 4 centuries later on the icy shores of Greenland. While we're waiting for our ferry to reach the Shetland and Faroe Islands, our trip back in time in quest of the Vikings will take us first of all to southern Norway. We have very few clues available to learn about the true identity of the Vikings. They left hardly any traces, no written texts, no images. The only thing that speaks for them are the relics found in archaeological digs. A few dozen kilometers south of Oslo, in Kaupang, we meet with Unn Petersen, an archaeologist. She took part in the excavation of this ancient Viking town.
The oldest Viking town of Norway was located right here. It was home to a host of craftsmen and tradesfolk. And if we continue along this cliff, we'll come in sight of the sea. The waves used to come right up to the foot of the cliff because the sea level used to be higher, about 3 meters higher than it is now. There used to be a bay here. The dwellings were on the other side of the bay. All the houses, there were about 100 in all, were lined up on the shore facing the sea.
Det vi fant ut her jo det at man har et bysamfunn da I Norge allerede på 800-tallet.
Every house had a well in back where they could draw spring water.
Og de bor tett I tett.
On the other side, you had the docks for the boats. They'd come in and leave from there. That's where they loaded and unloaded the merchandise. There used to be quite a bit of commercial activity going on here.
It's hard to imagine the docks of Khao Phang bustling with activity. Time has taken its toll, and all that's left is the vague outline of a wooden boat half buried in the ground, and some rudimentary stone graves. However, the archaeological digs carried out here have yielded their share of relics. In addition to arms and jewelry, of which the finest pieces are in an Oslo museum, Unn Petersen has unearthed a variety of small objects, which in their simplicity attest to the wealth and diversity of commercial activity that went on at Khao Phang.
This is a shard of pottery from the Rhine region. It's quite typical of the big vessels. It was probably used to transport the wine that was imported here to Khao Phang. There are also beads that come from the Mediterranean and from Central Asia. And here we have another bead from the Mediterranean that was probably made in Byzantium.
Kan ha blitt produsert I Bysants.
The geography of the country, with its thousands of kilometers of rugged coastline, notched with its protective fjords, played an important role in the development of Viking society and the enduring maritime tradition that even today persists in Norway from the north to the south. The first Viking settlements here were, like the capital Oslo, founded and developed in the shelter of the fjords. And at the end of the 19th century, in the fjord of Oslo, farmers happened upon the vestiges of funeral boats, first at Gokstad and Tuna, then at Osberg. It was the custom at the time to place the remains of the more important members of the community inside a boat that was then buried under a mound of earth. The boats were brought to Oslo and can now be seen in the Viking Ships Museum. These long ships have a line that is so harmonious, so pure, so modern, that it's hard to believe they were designed more than 1,000 years ago.
Gokstad and Tuna are male graves, but Osberg turned out to be a female grave. The skeletons of 2 women were found, and it is the richest and best equipped Viking grave ever found, which speaks for the position of the leading lady in the grave and also tells quite a lot about the position of women in Viking Age society. The Viking society was pagan, and the funeral customs demanded that you were given equipment for life after death. So in well-equipped graves we find jewelry and kitchen equipment for the women, weapons and tools for the men. And in the case of the objects in this museum, the preservation in the ground has been remarkably good, so we have the leather, textiles and wood, which is usually lost.
Certain objects that were found in the boats, along with the very simple household utensils, have revealed a surprising degree of refinement and artistic inspiration in their depiction of strange creatures and imaginary animals. The dragon heads, which were carried on wooden poles during the religious ceremonies, recall the figureheads that adorned the drakars to protect them from the evil spirits of the sea. It was probably aboard a much simpler ship, a knar, that one day Thorvald left the Jærdern Valley in southern Norway, thus inadvertently writing the first page of the incredible adventure known as the Saga of Eric the Red.
There was a man named Thorvald, son of Oswald, son of Ulf, son of Thorisson. His son's name was Eric the Red. On account of manslaughter, Thorvald and his son were obliged to leave Jærdern and go to Iceland, which had already been colonized.
Propelled by the winds, Thorvald's boat headed for the northwest. After 3 days of sailing and a stopover in the Shetland Islands, he continued his route towards the north and landed on the Faroe Islands, known at the time as the Sheep Islands. A short stopover at the Shetland Islands during the night, and early the next morning the Norrøna docks at Torshavn, the main town of the Faroes. The Vikings had colonized this little archipelago at the beginning of the 9th century. The settlers were mainly farmers, which is why today the inhabitants of the island, who are fishermen renowned and sought after throughout the North Atlantic, say that the Vikings had to stop here because they were seasick. Our stopover is very short, just the time to take on a few passengers, and the Norrøna once again sets sail in the direction of Iceland.
This is the only North link we have. This is the only ferry sailing here, and it's also connected. You know, all the Scandinavian people and also all the northern country here, Iceland, Faroe Island and Greenland, we are all connected. Maybe not so much Greenland because that's so far away, but Iceland and Faroe Island, Shetland, Norway, Denmark especially.
These mountains that thrust up from the ocean floor radiate an imposing force, a poetic force like that found in the Edda of Snorri Sturluson, a 13th century tale that relates the creation of the world.
The sons of Bor slew the giant Ymir and carried him into the center of the bottomless abyss of Ginakakap, and thus the world was born. From his blood, they created the sea and the lakes, from his flesh, the earth, and from his bones, the mountains. As for the stones and boulders, they made them out of his teeth, and his jawbones, and chips of his broken bones. From the blood that flowed continuously from his wounds, they created the ocean that girdled the world.
After another night of sailing, we come into view of Iceland. At the end of the 19th century, the canars of the first Norwegian colonists, carried by the prevailing currents, approached the island from the east. Before they even set foot on land, they tossed overboard the traditional innstafar, a large wooden post that came from the house they had left behind in Norway, and that they used for a bench during the voyage. It would drift with the current and waves, and according to tradition, the place where it ran aground was where they should build their new home. And according to the legend, this is what Thorvald did when he reached the island in the second half of the 10th century. Iceland had all the elements of a land of adventure, not only for the clan of Thorvald and Eric the Red, but for the hundreds of new settlers who followed and found themselves confronted with this barren, icy landscape. These brave men who had lived through the perils of the ocean eventually began to feel at home in this land whipped by the winds and jolted by volcanoes. For the pagan Vikings of that time, the powerful wind, the roaring torrents and cascades, just like the brilliant stars and the mighty sea currents that brought them to this country of Iceland, all these natural phenomena were simply the expression of divine and mysterious forces. Whether it was in the center of the island where the mighty Gullfoss waterfalls thunder down, or on the coastline, the settlements expanded and life took root. The immigrants were not all banished like Thorvald. Some of them left Norway because the population had outgrown the available farmland. And there were also the sons of kings and nobles that the sagas speak of, and who came to Iceland because of the Viking law stipulating that the eldest son inherit everything. What do the Norse sagas, which are veritable romantic epics of the people of the North, really tell us about the Vikings that came to settle in Iceland in the 10th century?
A saga is a written or oral narrative which tells the story of one man or a family who comes from Norway and settles down in Iceland, and the main protagonist is very often a hero or even a son of a farmer who goes abroad and tries himself at the court of Norwegian kings or Danish kings and comes back and is a man that has some responsibility in the society. Well, the sagas are really documents of the imagination, and imagination can be a sort of reality if you look at it that way. They sort of describe life how it was in the 10th century, but it can give a reflect picture of the 13th century. So we don't know what is really, how life was there, but we know from the sagas that there's a description of a society which really existed either in the 13th century or in the 10th century.
Here, just as in Norway, only archaeology can really give us the answers to our questions. So let's head for Singvellir in the center of the island. Adolf, with his team of young archaeologists, is overseeing the dig on the historical site of Singvellir. From the year 930 on, this was the meeting place of the Althing, the Viking parliament.
It's all about the best numbers.
As a scientist, how reliable does he consider the sagas?
Ever since the beginning of archaeological research in Iceland, there has been a controversy about the historical accuracy of the sagas and their relevance to archaeology. Archaeology in Iceland was, in fact, born from a romantic interest in the sagas. In the beginning, the archaeologists worked mainly on sites that they had learned of and were inspired by the sagas. It is, in fact, an age-old argument that will perhaps never be settled. Now the specialists are much more cautious in their approach to the sagas. But all the same, we can't just ignore or dismiss them. What we have to do is carry on our research and continue using this ancestral material because it has proven to be an invaluable source of information on medieval society.
Once again, as in Kaupang in Norway, archaeology is the only way to provide a response to the romanticized sagas and to find out who the Vikings were and how they lived. Working from some walls of stone and peat that were unearthed, the archaeologists have been able to produce a faithful reconstruction of a Viking dwelling for the layperson. Less scientific but more fun is this Viking village that was built in Hafnarfjordur, near Reykjavik. Every 2 years, hundreds of Vikings gather from all corners of Scandinavia for a huge festival. It was on the shores of this bay, where Reykjavik is now located, that Eric the Red settled after his father Thorvald died. Eric got married and had a son, Leif, the future discoverer of America. Here is his statue standing before the impressive basalt church, one of the symbols of the city. The port, which is usually bustling with activity, is strangely deserted. The immobile fishing boats lined up as if for inspection. Today is the 17th of June, the national holiday, commemorating the founding of the Republic in 1944. Before that date, Iceland was a possession of the Kingdom of Denmark. Today, these sons and daughters of Vikings, who have one of the highest standards of living in Europe, have a very simple, sober way of celebrating the event. The ceremonies establishing the Republic of Iceland took place here, on this historic site of Singvellir. Here at Lögberg is where the Viking parliament proclaimed its laws, and where the act founding the Republic of Iceland was signed. And it was on this very spot that Sven Björnsson was sworn in as the first president before a good-sized crowd, in spite of the rain. Þingvellir embodies the soul of Iceland, and the site is breathtaking. But that's surely not the only reason that the Vikings chose it as the epicenter of their society. They must have sensed that powerful telluric forces were at work here in this canyon. Indeed, Þingvellir is located on the exact spot where the tectonic plates of Europe and North America are pulling apart. Birgir, a member of parliament, comes here to Þingvellir often. Perhaps it is to renew the contact with these forces.
Here we didn't have a monarch, we didn't have a king. We had 39 local leaders or chieftains who had an equal standing, and they decided on how the law should be, and they appointed people to courts of justice. But we had no national leader, no monarch, no king.
It's likely that Thorvald and later Eric the Red, like all the Viking chieftains, took part in the assemblies of the Althing.
The place was very crowded. People from all over the country came here. Probably thousands of people came here, gathered here for 2 weeks in late June. People came here to make business, to meet each other, to tell stories, and also to make new laws.
Eric, who had the same impulsive character as his father, also committed a crime, and like his father, was also condemned by the Althing to 3 years of exile.
For the people at the time, exile was one of the means available for enforcing the law. We don't have enough information to determine whether it was a widespread practice and how many people were exiled. There are very few texts concerning this particular period. It's most likely that these judgments took place at Þingvellir. It was quite a harsh sentence. The condemned person had to go abroad for 3 years. But in a certain way, exile was a means of preserving the peace. It was a moderate sanction designed to keep people from taking the law into their own hands to settle more serious conflicts.
So once again, Eric has to take to the sea. He gathers together his family and a few friends, refits his knar, and sets out from Iceland. But to go where? Turning back to the Faroe or Shetland Islands is out of the question, even less so to Norway. So he takes a great leap into the unknown. He heads northwest. After 4 days of sailing with the currents, he reaches a new land that he christens Greenland. Seen from above, Greenland looks like a vast expanse of ice. 2,400 kilometers long, it is the largest in the northern hemisphere. How could Eric the Red call it Greenland? There's no maritime route connecting Greenland and Iceland, so we take a plane to the southern part of the country to try to pick up the trail of Eric the Red. It's summer in Greenland. Between the years 1000 and 1500, the country underwent a period of gradual cooling. Then the pendulum swung the other way, and the climate warmed between the year 1500 and the year 2000. This is why the summers now are just like the summers that Eric the Red experienced when he arrived here. And during the summer, the southern fjords are choked with icebergs. With the heat, the ice pack that's further north splits apart and frees a large quantity of icebergs. Carried by the currents, they drift down to the south. Accompanied by Salik, our Inuit guide, we travel up the fjord that will lead us to Brattahlid, where Eric the Red is said to have landed and founded his colony. Here, unlike the first impression of the island, green pasture land lines the shores of the fjord due to the presence of the many icebergs. Eric the Red was right. This is truly a green land.
Eric the Red lived here in Greenland for 3 years because he has killed some people in Iceland, and he discovered the land, and he came back to Iceland and told them about this amazing green land. And in Iceland there was starting to be an overpopulation. It was a lack of good land, agricultural land, so it was very attractive for people to find new land, and then it was easy to convince them about this amazing land. So 27 ships went away for Greenland, but only 13 made it. The use at that time was, of course, the open Viking ships with sail, and they brought everything with them. They even had pigs with them, sheep, of course, horses, cows, cats, and all their belongings, furniture and tools, everything to start a new colony.
At Brattahlid, the new colonists built their house according to the principles and plans established for centuries in Scandinavia, the land of their ancestors. Like in Iceland, there are no trees in Greenland, so the Vikings have to settle for the wood they brought with them, or trunks and branches that washed up onto the beaches.
The culture or the community structure was the same in Iceland as it was in Greenland. There was the political system with a chief, Eric the Red, and his son, Leif Erikson. But later, the political system changed. The chief lost their power, and the power was given to the Ting, the parliament.
We leave the Erik Fjord on board the fishing boat that took us to Brattahlid and head for Narsak, one of the main towns of southern Greenland. Autonomy on May 1st, 1979, now has its own flag, marked with a red and white circle. During official ceremonies, it flies side by side with the Danish flag. It's the 21st of June, the longest day of the year, the day the Greenlanders chose to celebrate their national holiday. Even though Christianity was introduced around the year 1000, the Inuits continued to practice their shamanistic rituals long after, and believed in a host of gods and spirits. It was not until the beginning of the 20th century that Christianity finally became dominant. Now the majority of the 60,000 Greenlanders are Protestant. Today, Greenland is a country with a very strong sense of its Inuit identity. The few thousand whites living on the west coast are mostly from Denmark. But what became of the descendants of Eric the Red? Did they live side by side with the Inuits? One of the answers is to be found 2 hours from Narsak by speedboat. There are no roads in Greenland. The only way to get from one town to another is by boat. There are the coastal express boats that run between coast towns on a fixed timetable, but you can also take a taxi boat. But they both depend on the condition of the sea route. Just a few hours before our departure, the passage was still blocked. Then suddenly, it opened up as if by magic. We're coming into Qaqortoq. Along with Narsak, it's one of the two major towns, 3,500 inhabitants. Most of them are sheep raisers or fishermen. Qaqortoq was founded in 1775 to convert the local population to Christianity. But already in 1721, a Norwegian, Hans Egede, landed here in search of traces of the Vikings. He didn't find any. And yet, many had followed Eric the Red from Iceland to settle here in the south of Greenland.
So this is the Qaqortoq, the Valsund church ruin of the Norsemen that came to Greenland in year approximately 1000. This is the most important building of all the buildings that have been built here from the Norsemen's time. And this has always been the big center of all the Catholic Norse that lived in Greenland. As you can see around here, lots of ruins, like 15 of them. And there were more than 200 settlements lying around all over. And if they all were inhabited at the same time, there would be more than 2,000 Norse living there. The first man that came here, he was not religious. He was not Christian. But then only 15 years later, they built this church as Catholicism has arrived to South Greenland, to the Norse people. They made big celebrations within the new weddings of other settlements coming together, and they have a settlement. And then they have the celebration of wedding. The last one we ever heard was in the year 1409. That was then when there was a wedding, and people believe that the wedding might have been from a Norseman and a Greenlander married together, because normally when all people are getting married, both are being told very, very accurately. But this woman was hardly mentioned, only that she was there and her name was that. That's why the sagas do believe that she maybe was a Greenlander and marrying a Norse.
The Valsa Church is the last trace of the Viking presence in Greenland. It now seems they have discovered the ruins of the country's very first church in Brattahlid, where Eric the Red landed. A church financed, according to the sagas, by the wife of Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red. Life in Brattahlid didn't seem to suit Leif's temperament. He wasn't cut out to be a farmer. He decided to take to the sea once again. Unlike his father and grandfather Thorvald, he hadn't committed any crime, so if he left, it was not because he was banished, but simply because he yearned for new adventures and perhaps to discover new lands.
A man called Bjarni Herjolfsson that went to Greenland was blown out of course and saw land to the west again and came back to Greenland and told about it. And Leif Erikson were fast to buy a ship and go discovering America. And he asked his father, old Eric the Red, here at this place, if he would like to join him. Eric the Red said, yes, I would like to do so. So he was riding down to the beach with his horse, but he fell down from the horse and broke his collarbone. He took it as a sign and he stayed home. So Leif Erikson went alone for this explore.
So Leif sailed from Greenland with 35 men, and as it is written in the sagas,
Leifre headed for the open sea and sailed for a long time, and he discovered lands whose existence he hadn't even suspected before.
Leif had discovered America, which he named Vinland. The continual conflicts with the Native Americans dissuaded the Vikings from founding a permanent settlement in Vinland, present-day Newfoundland. Around 1020, they left the New World for good and went back to Greenland. Despite the presence of a small parcel of Viking heritage in the genetic makeup of the Greenlanders, the youth of Qaqortoq and Narsaq are more concerned about clothes fashions from New York and Copenhagen than by the exploits of Eric the Red and Leif Erikson. And it's quite understandable. The Aleja Ituk, the regional boat, is leaving Qaqortoq and heading for Narsaq. The sea is calm, and the passage seems clear of the drifting ice. The ship is progressing cautiously. Sometimes it slows almost to a halt. On the radar screen, the boat looks like it's completely surrounded by drift ice. We've managed to make our way out of the risky area, and we're picking up speed. In less than an hour, we'll be in Narsak, just in time to attend the big annual picnic held every year on June 21st to celebrate the national holiday. The progressive cooling of Greenland's climate from the year 1000 on, little by little decimated the Vikings' herds, and they gradually abandoned sheep and cattle raising. At the beginning, the cohabitation with the Inuits was peaceful, but the lack of food forced the Vikings to take up hunting and fishing, and disputes began to break out.
Well, the Inuit people, they live on the sea, while the Norse, they were farmers. They were unable to live on the land at the end because they became too many. But it's important also to remember that they couldn't change their way of living because they were unable to catch as much seal as needed to survive. They used netting, while the Eskimos had great hunting gear with harpoons and so on. And the Norse, they didn't know how to. That could be one of the reasons that the Norse disappeared.
Now, 5 centuries after the passing of the last descendants of Eric the Red, Greenland is once again enjoying a mild climate, like in the year 1000. A mythical island covered in pure white ice and green prairies, the promised land for the intrepid Viking navigators, Greenland today seems to have once again become a haven of peace, lost in the middle of the Atlantic. Halfway between old Europe, where Thorvald, Eric the Red's father, set out, and America, which 5 centuries before Christopher Columbus was discovered by his son, Leif Erikson.